To share my screen.
There you are.
Okay. Let me minimize. All right. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this is our topic today, supporting students with interrupted formal education. I am Brenda Custodio, and my co-presenter is Judith O'Loughlin.
Hi.
And I have to do the arrow. Okay. I'm from Columbus, Ohio. I worked as an ESL teacher and administrator, and now I am doing professional development. And Judy and I have written a couple of books together, which we're going to talk about later. And we are doing this series of presentations for Kelly and the English language portal on students with limited and interrupted formal education. So Judy, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Judy O'Loughlin. I live in San Ramon, California. I am a former K-8 ESL teacher and adjunct professor for New Jersey City University. And I work with Brenda on writing and presenting for conferences, as well as in school districts and departments of education. So nice to meet all of you.
Where'd my little arrow go? Okay, whoop, went too far. Okay, so this is our agenda for tonight. We are going to be interchangeably using SIFE and SLIFE, and we'll talk about what those two words mean in just a minute. I see from the chat that almost all of you are ESL teachers, so I'm assuming this is not a new term for you. But we're going to talk about who those students are, what are the causes of their schooling, the two main groups of students who are SLIFE in Western schools, and they would be our refugees and our Latino students. What issues are unique to this specific population, and the academic and social and emotional supports that are needed to help these students. So this is approximately a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll have some time at the end to discuss any questions that you want to put in the chat. So there, we're interchangeably using these two terms. SIFE is the older of the two terms. It stands for Students with Interrupted Formal Education. I think it came from New York. I'm not sure who created that term in the first place, but that's where I first heard it. It's used predominantly in New York, the East Coast, and in parts of the Midwest. And then in 2009, there was a book that came out by Andrea DiCaprio and a couple other authors, and she used the term SLIFE, Students with Limited or Interrupted Formal Education. So that's the term that's become more popular. She added the word limited because she wanted to make sure that the reader realized that some of these students actually come with no formal education. So it's beyond the idea of interrupted. We have not had a lot of these students lately, mainly because the number of refugees has dropped so dramatically in the last 4 years. But with the new administration and the new refugee ceiling, we expect that population to increase dramatically over the next few months and probably over the next 4 years. So we're going to start off with this graphic. And if we were in person, we would have time to stop and think about these 4 different quadrants. We want to know what do you know where most of these SIFE learners come from in US and Canadian schools? What are the causes of their interrupted education? And what are the challenges facing SIFE and the teachers who work with SIFE? So we're going to give you just a minute or two to put into the chat so we can see how much you already know about SIFE. And we don't have time to go into detail, but at least it'll give us an idea of the population and the audience that we're dealing with. Let's see if I can figure out. Okay, I can't see the chat myself.
Oh, I can see the chat.
Okay.
We have a
Okay, good.
couple of people who have graded themselves as 5s.
Okay.
One is this is all new to me, a few 4s,
Okay.
4s and 5s that
All
I
right,
can
good.
see so
Good,
far,
good.
and a 3.
And a 3. So we want to start off with this table from Debbie Short and Beverly Boyson. They did a study, a nationwide study conducted by CAL, the Center for Applied Linguistics, when they were looking at newcomers. And we know that most of our SIFE are newcomers. And they said there are 3 basic types of newcomer students who are coming to our classrooms. We have the students who come in literate. They have pretty much the equivalent of the Western education in whatever school system they were attending before they move here. So they have first language literacy, they understand grade level content, and because of that, we as ESL teachers know that their English language literacy development comes much faster. They are the typical students with the 2 years of speaking English, but 4 to 7 of being able to be totally proficient in English, or at least close to proficient. Then we have students who are literate with partial schooling. So they've had some interruption, but not a dramatic interruption. So they're going to make like an average time of building their English language development. But the third category are the SIFE. And these are kids who often do not have much, if any, first language literacy. They obviously speak their home language, but they may have very little experience in reading and writing it. They may have been to school for 2, 3, 4 years, and then for whatever reason had to leave. And we're going to talk about some of those reasons in a minute. Because of that, they're probably not on track with grade level content as well, especially math. So these students not only need help with English and literacy, but they need help with math. And we have seen from different researchers that often these students take up to 10 years to reach the same level of English proficiency as their peers. And we know when kids only have 12 years of school that unless they come pretty young, they are not going to be able to reach proficiency by the time that we expect them to graduate in the typical 12 years. So who are these students? Well, the definition that we think of that is the most common, the most prevalent, is it's students who have had 2 years or more of interrupted schooling. A lot of people are asking us in the last year, well, aren't all of our students having interrupted education right now? And that is definitely true. In fact, I wanted to mention that Judy and I were sent an article, I think, that came out of Educational Researcher, and it was called Generation Interrupted, Rethinking Students with Interrupted Formal Education in the Wake of a Pandemic. And the author of this is Chris Chang Bacon. And he talks about how we need to be thinking about all of our students right now having interrupted education and what can we do for them. But when we talk about SIFE or SLIFE, we are focusing in on the English language learner, the immigrant who is coming, who for several possible different reasons has not had consistent schooling. So we know some of those are immigrants who come from Mexico and Central America. And we're going to look at some of those specific countries in a minute and why the situations there could have kept them from having consistent or equivalent schooling before they leave and come to the US. And we also know that for some of these students, it's the journey themselves that's the problem. They might have had uninterrupted schooling before they leave their home country, but it's not like you get on a plane and you end up in the US the next day. For most of our students that are SIFE, they've had some kind of traumatic experience either in the home country, during the journey, sitting in a refugee camp, whatever, that has kept them for months or years from being in school. So we do have the immigrants from Latin America. We have refugees, and we're going to talk about those numbers in a minute. And we know that there is no real national data collected on these students. Many states don't even ask students if they've had interrupted schooling. They don't keep data on how long they've been interrupted or how much schooling they had before. There was one nationwide study done about 3 or 4 years ago that looked at test scores, and they were saying that about 11% of our secondary students would be considered SIFE. But I'm not sure how they came up with that 11%, or, I think it was self-reported data from the students who took a particular test. So as we mentioned before, most of these students are going to fall into 2 categories, refugees and Latinos, and we're going to look at each of them separately. This is a graph put out by the Migration Policy Institute on the number of refugees who have come into the US in the last 40 years. So it goes back to 1980, which is when the current refugee policy went into place. It was formed after Vietnam and the Southeast Asian refugees that were coming in from Cambodia and Laos as well. And at that time, our refugee ceiling was almost at 200,000. So the blue line is the amount of people that the president, there's something called a presidential determination, and the president decides every year on October 1st how many refugees will be permitted into the US that year. And they use different criteria to decide that, how many people we can actually handle, how many people are in the camps, discussion with the UN, all this kind of stuff. So that's the highest number we ever had. And you can see it dropped from there to about 1983. It was all the way down to 65,000, which is sort of the average. It went back up in the 90s. Part of that was because of Ethiopia and Somalia. So the numbers went back up to about 140,000 were permitted. You can see the blue line is the number allowed, but the orange line is how many actually came. So it's pretty close, but not exactly. The biggest difference is in 2001, because after 9/11, we changed the whole criteria of how people are vetted or how people are interviewed and so on, who's allowed to come and all that sort of thing. So it took a while to get back up to where the 2 lines match. And then, as you can see, when the previous administration with President Trump came in, one of his policies was to cut down on immigration, period. And so you can see why the numbers dropped so dramatically down to less than about 15,000 in 2020. There's been recent news about President Biden has raised the number back up to about 65,000 for this year, but I'm not sure how many of them have actually come yet, because so much of the the process for letting people in had been dismantled. The refugee camp interviews, the places that were allowing people to come in, and the places around the US that did refugee resettlement, a lot of those were just decimated in the last 4 years. So it's going to take a while to ramp back up, and I'm not sure if we're going to meet that 65,000 or not, but at least it's in the works, and it's possible. So we know in the camps, this is what a typical school would look like. About 2/3 of the education is overseen by the UNHCR, that's United Nations High Commission on Refugees. The other third is by the governments in the countries where the refugees are actually living. Class size is obviously an issue. You can see the different teacher-pupil ratio, and 100 to 1, if you can imagine. We complain about class size, but it's nothing like this. So we've also had situations where students don't have textbooks. These kids at least have a chalkboard. Some places don't even have that. So it depends on the situation, how long the camp's been there, how much money they have, how much the country's willing to supplement or support the schooling in that country. So this is one of the reasons that kids who come as refugees have had this limited or interrupted education. We also get a larger number of our students who are coming from Latin America. And this is obviously a map of Latin America. But the majority of our students are coming from what we call the Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Those are the three northernmost countries in Central America that speak Spanish. Belize is also up there, but we don't get a lot of students from Belize, and I'm not sure why. They do speak English, or at least a form of English. And there are some families coming from Belize, but not to the extent of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So educational expectation in Latin America is very different than what we would expect here. For many of the countries, only 8 to 9 years of schooling is required. So their compulsory education ends about age 13 in most of these countries. Often the families must pay for uniforms and textbooks. So even at the elementary level, although school may be free and may be required, nobody actually comes around to see if the children are going to school. In many of the poorer rural areas, their facilities are not good, poorly trained teachers, just many situations that keep the children from having a consistent education that would be the equivalent of what we would expect for, grade 3 or grade 5, whatever. We also know that time is the critical factor for these children. So we know that Cummins and Collier both did studies on how long it takes a child to learn English. And they said that students with significant gaps in their formal schooling may need 10 years or more to develop this proficiency. So that's almost double what we usually think of as the 4 to 7. So the average would be like 5 to 6. Now we're saying it's 10 years for these students. So how do we help them get through this as quickly as possible? What can we do to provide them with the support that they need, the academic support? And then we're also going to talk in a minute about the non-academic kinds of issues that our students have. Social and emotional issues that's very much in the know right now in the news. What can we do to help these students? And it's unfortunately a lot of that is left on the ESL teacher. What can you do to help these students to catch up? And one of the things that we're going to talk about in our pathway, our SLIFE pathway, is to give you some ideas for helping these students. So what kind of issues are unique to a SIFE student? Well, they're frequently suffering from stress-related issues. As you can see, if you're a refugee, that means you've left your home country, you're sitting in a camp. The average length of time to stay in a camp before you are resettled somewhere is 17 years. So this is not like you leave your home and you sit for 6 months in a camp and then you get to go somewhere else. And only about 1% of the people who are living in a refugee camp get resettled each year. So that means many of these people living in camps are never going to get resettled somewhere. Some end up going back home. Some do get the permission to live in somewhere else. But for too many of them, it's just like a permanent living in these new camps. And it's a horrible situation. They have literacy and academic requirements that are due to these missing years of school. You can't just come from a refugee camp and sit in a school. And even if you had English, you're missing so much. And for many of these students, they have to learn English and then try to catch up with all the academic requirements at the same time. They often experience frequent and strong bouts of frustration because they just can't do what they see their peers able to do. And they're embarrassed and they're frustrated and they get angry. So they either will turn in on themselves and just kind of shut down, or they get angry and will turn violent in some cases. And then we have the much higher risk of dropping out. And it's estimated that about 70% of our English learners who have interrupted schooling will drop out before they graduate. So now I'm turning this over to Judy. She's going to talk about social and emotional supports that we can do for these students.
Okay, hi everyone. So let me see if I can change the slides. We see you, but they don't see me, but that's okay. Yeah, I think you're
Do a
gonna
little ding and I'll change the slide.
ding ding. Okay. A very good article in Color in Colorado, written by Christina Robinson, mentioned 10 things that schools can do to support students with interrupted formal education. And you can access that just by looking her up by name on Color in Colorado's website. So the whole school has to be involved, and there has to be a supportive environment within the school. A newcomer program would be very helpful to these students so that they're separated in the beginning for their specific learning needs. They usually need basic literacy and numeracy classes. They don't have the kinds of skills in both number understanding and or learning to read and reading to learn that your typical newcomer with uninterrupted education might have, because he has that basis in his first language. So there has to be a collaboration also between the classroom teachers and the English language teachers and all the support personnel. So this requires a lot of training within a school. There needs to be some flexible scheduling when possible. And both Brenda and I have heard about places where the students, for example, the high school students who also need to help support their families, may go to school half a day and then go out to work with, so, the school has worked out a schedule where they can go out to earn money while they're still going to school so that they won't drop out. Use of sheltered instruction is really encouraged. A lot of modifications and accommodations when possible. And actually, a lot of times we both talk about what's the difference between a modification and accommodation for the different learners and the different SIFE learners and their basic needs. Teaching them strategies so that they can help themselves. And that's one thing. If you do a lot of reading and you've read works by Dr. Anna Shimo, she talks about the release of teaching them the strategy and having them take over the strategy and using it on their own. And that's the most important thing, is that you're not just showing them what to do, you're helping them help themselves. To teach students these basic strategies, and building partnerships with local organizations that I know that one place that I've worked in, they brought in speakers who were successful in the community to encourage students to stay in school, and how they would understand and help the schools by supporting the learning of the students, just by what they were able to talk about that transition from not understanding to understanding, and all the resources that are available in the community to support the immigrant students and their families. Okay, Brenda, ding ding. The basic literacy and numeracy classes are really important. They're missing years of formal education, and if you see them sitting, as you did in that picture, with slates, and they're all together, and they're all at different levels, and they're all different ages, so how can they all catch up and learn? So that the students need extra support to catch up with their language and mathematics skills gaps. So how do we best assist them in filling in the gap? And it varies by the age of the student and the size of the gap. Okay. A school needs to have a supportive environment. We've done some writing about this as well. It's, how do you create that community in the school that is welcoming and indicates to these students that they're welcome here, there are supports here for them, people care about them. Not just their ESL teacher, but other people in the building. So a school that's really aware of this and comfortable is very critical for all students. And if you yourself have ever And I have done this myself as a child, moved from New York to New Jersey, entering school in the 5th grade, and felt so unwelcome when I first moved to this very rural community in New Jersey, coming from New York City. Um, and so you can imagine what it's like for these students if it's not welcoming for them. That welcoming environment has a really positive impact on their academic and their social and emotional growth. Okay. So we do some talking about trauma in our work, and it involves the exposure to experience that are w- beyond one's capacity to cope. So it's really not difficult to imagine how incredible the stress is to being held to a level of performance and accountability that exceeds their their expectations at their age. This is a daily experience for the SIFE student, coming into class and sitting for 6 hours with listening to words that you don't understand, trying to understand the body language of the other students and the teachers, looking at the board and not being able to read what's on the board. So all these things are very, very traumatic to these students. And then going home and being immersed back in your native culture and native language, and then having to come back the next morning and start all over again. These are really traumatic experiences for them. Okay. Um, they're all the emotional supports are really often needed for these learners because the situation that caused them to leave their home country is this is where they find themselves here. They've had war and persecution. They've been displaced from their home. They've had flight and migration. They've lived with extreme poverty. They may have lived with family and community violence. And so they come to America not knowing what's going to happen for them. And, there's still these fears that they're not sure. Can they walk on the street? Is it safe to get to school? Will I be safe in school? Are there people there to help me? And so, and needing clothing and shoes and food and everything that they have been living without for a long time. Okay. So the types of behavior that might be result from the trauma could be, so they definitely would have decreased attention or concentration, and they might withdraw from others, or they might have angry outbursts or aggression or extreme absenteeism. So you can have one or both in terms of the stress that they're under when they're experiencing new learning activities that they're not comfortable with or don't understand. They can become very withdrawn and silent, or they can be very angry and slam their fists or take their aggressions out angrily, or they just don't come to school. They can also have physical reactions such as headaches or stomach aches, um, as well as other things. I've had in my own life students who would pick at their fingers or pick at their corners of their mouths or pull at their hair because of this stress and frustration. And those are things you have to look out for. They might overreact to noise or physical contact, or sudden movements. A fire drill could set them off and they could be running out of the building because of fear. They might have difficulty with authority or redirection or criticism by a teacher or someone in the cafeteria. So all these things are something that you have to be really careful of. They might be re-experiencing the trauma through nightmares or disturbing memories, or they could experience hyperarousal, which something like a fire drill might do, or an announcement over the loudspeaker might bring, stress them out continuously. They might avoid certain behaviors that would be fearful to them. They might fear going to places that remind them of the different negative events. Okay. So we've done some work on resilience as well, building the resilience of the learner. And this kind of came out of conversations that we had about just general English language learners, like, you have 2 or 3 kids from one family, and why does one do well and the others are, they never exit ESL, they're constantly struggling. And so now looking at, we did some research on this as well, what resilience means, and going forward with building resilient learners. Okay. And so one of the people that did some research, and this research was originally for native English speakers, and it has been adopted or adapted for English language learners. Her name was Edith Grotberg, and she did some work in the Netherlands. And she has, if you just Google her name, you'll find her study. And she talks about 3 strategies. They're called the I have, I am, and I can strategies. So what I've done for this is I've put together a table, I guess 2 columns, for what teachers can do and what the learner can do to become resilient. And we'll go into more of this when we do our pathway our 5-hour presentations. So strategy 1 is the I have. So you want to help the student see that he has strong relationships with among the people in the school and with the people in their family, and on the student side, resources that are available to offer them support, so that I have right now a series of people that I can turn to that can support me. And then you build on that strategy, the I have, to expand on it, to look at as they become more comfortable in the school and how that group of resources and relationships increases. Um, so then the second one is I am, and this one is the power of the narrative. So it on the teacher point is that the teachers help the students really develop who they are and what they are, and what I am and how I am growing as I am living in the school. Um, there are positive characteristics the newcomer sees in himself. Um, and so you work with them to do some writing about who they are and periodically write about it. And so it's the power of this narrative and the power of the story. And finally, the third strategy is using problem-based models of instruction. This is the I can. So if I can tap into people that will help me in social interactions or solving academic problems, this is my resource group. And I can do this now, but if I need help, I will then turn to the I have to use some of my resources. But the I can keeps growing as you keep learning your language. Your I can ability keeps growing and growing. And you think about your own self, over the times of your life when you've learned something new, and how you can do more and more, so that you can then talk about what you can do, and teachers will help them with their learning about what they can do. Okay. So how long will they need special assistance? And somebody asked that, Beth Skelton asked that in the chat, and there's no set amount of time because each of your students is different. And if we could really, find the perfect answer to that, it would be wonderful. How long is it going to take? Upper grades obviously take more time because there's more complex thinking, there's more increased academic vocabulary. And you take an academic textbook for an upper grader and look at the compound complex sentence structure, the references to things that happened in the past, for example, in a social studies book, or looking towards the future, and the kinds of things that take you on an aside in reading literature to a thought that's not in a straight sequential line, and it's more difficult for older students. It also depends on the amount and quality of any previous education, the age of the student's ability, and also the social and emotional aspects of the child. How good are they at accepting challenges that cause them to fail at something, and how can they how do they recover? How long is their recovery period? And then the program dynamics. What's the quality of the program, of the teacher, the length of time devoted to instruction, the quality of materials. One of the things that Collier and Thomas looked at a long time ago in their longitudinal study was, did the student receive instruction every day? And how long was that instruction? And was it consistent? So if the student is only getting instruction 3 days a week because of the lack of staff, then he or she is sitting in a classroom and not able to learn some of the basics he needs to succeed and begin to learn more higher level academics. Okay. So we'll turn to this and we'll go into more depth in those particular things when we meet with you in the courses. So this is what's coming up. This is like the coming attractions. If you get to go to the movies now, which you can. So we are going to have 3 courses, significantly limited or interrupted formal education pathway, SLIFE. It's a 3 to 5 hour course series. A SLIFE overview is the first course, developmental literacy is the second course, and filling the language gap and content gap is the third course. Okay, next. So the initial introductory course is an overview of students with interrupted or limited formal education, or SLIFE. Okay. So we'll explore some of the causes. We'll go into a little bit more depth than we did tonight about this disruption. We'll describe the diversity found in this student group and the challenges faced by students with interrupted education, and how the challenges really impact your instructional decisions and your instructional design. We'll discuss academic and non-academic supports best to meet the needs of the various learners. So that's our first course. Next. So we will look at developmental literacy for the SLIFE learner, and that will be our second pathway. Okay. So we'll look at the challenges of creating a literacy program, the issues of limited first language literacy skills, and most of you who really know that if you have a strong basis in your first language, you can tap into that to help you with your second language, and a lot of what you transfer in terms of your understanding of how your first language developed helps you to develop your second language. So these students don't have that. We'll talk about a literacy program, academic vocabulary development, the role of vocabulary, strategies for vocabulary instruction. We'll work on some things about literature selection for SLIFE and the culturally appropriate text and text selection for content classes. Okay. And finally, we're going to look at filling in the language and content gap. And the third class will be, the third pathway will be all about content. So we'll look at the challenges in the content classes and how the gap affects academic success, and how we can support simultaneous language and content instruction, and math for SLIFE learners, building basic math skills, the role of vocabulary in math instruction, strategies and resources and to support SLIFE, classroom activities for gap closing, and specific resources for content teachers. And both of us have done some work on content lessons for the newcomer and the learner. And so we'll bring that to our content course. Okay, next. So Brenda and I have been joined at the hip for a number of years now, and we've written 2 books together and others separately. Our first book together was Students with Interrupted Formal Education, Bridging Where They Are and What They Need. And it gives you more in depth of what you experienced tonight. The foreword is written by Dr. Deborah Short. There are some charts and tables for you to use in this book, and every chapter has a study guide for a small group, book study group, if you were to do that in your school. Okay, and that's from Corwin Press. The second book, which just came out, is Supporting the Journey of English Learners After Trauma. And we do more about resilience and building resilience here. What is a trauma-sensitive school? what does it mean to create community in your school and in your classroom for these students? A team response to trauma. And also we looked at something which actually the pandemic had a lot to do with, is protecting educators from the effects of secondary trauma, and which we've all experienced this past year, more than a year. And it includes also a for further study at the end of each chapter with additional resources for educators. And this one's from the University of Michigan Press. Okay.
And I think that's it.
And that's it. And you got to see Brenda, but for some reason, I don't show up. So that's okay. So I think there are some questions. Can you look at the chat too, or do you want me to read you?
Okay, I can see you.
Oh, you can see me. Okay, I can see you. Hello, everyone. Okay.
Now I can see the chat. I couldn't see it while I was presenting.
Okay. I think the applications Tamara asked, is this geared more towards secondary levels or elementary as well? And so if you knew Brenda and you knew me, Brenda's experience is totally in secondary, and mine is bridging from elementary into middle. And so we'll bring to our this training a little bit of both, but it's mostly the challenges are greater going from middle to secondary. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But there are, and if we have, we can address the applications to middle to upper elementary, where the content, you go from learning to read to reading to learn, and that's where the challenge becomes greater. So I don't have, let me go back. Okay.
I see a question from Beth Skelton as well. It says, is there data on the difference in acquisition depending on when the students arrive? There is very little data, period, on SIFE. We really, really need a lot more research in this area. So if any of you are researchers, or that's your after school job or whatever, we need some people out there researching these children, and what are the most effective programs and policies, and just how can we get more push at the national levels that this is seen as a nationwide issue. Some states are very involved and keep a lot of data on even who's arriving. Other states have no clue. And I would look at their Department of Ed websites, and there's no mention whatsoever in SIFE. So it's very disjointed.
When we wrote the first book, we got a lot of questions the first time we presented at conferences about, did we have an intake document? And we did have a very basic one, but there was no definitive one state-wise or nationally. And so that's something in your own states you should be pushing for, is a way to document who these students are. One of the things I always found in my experience was that I would go from teacher to teacher and say, do you know that these are the ESL kids in your classroom? And this was even before SIFE. And many of the classroom teachers didn't know who was an ESL kid, and, were upset and frustrated by the lack of interaction, by kids putting their heads down on the desk, and, because they're so frustrated. So if that's what happened with the normal newcomer, can you imagine the issue with the SIFE newcomer? So it would really be helpful if you push towards something, or even in your own district, started to gather data that would help you to know who they are and where they've come from, and what they're willing to share with you about how much schooling they've had. So that's really important. Okay.
I see a question about if there's states that allow different graduation requirements for SLIFE. And I don't think there's any that have a specific requirement tied to the SLIFE itself. Some states do have a 5 and 6 year option. I know Ohio is one of those, but most districts don't want to do that because it cuts down on their grade card of how many students actually graduated in 4 years. So they really push these kids to finish in 4 years, and it some of that is one of the reasons that so many kids drop out, because they get so frustrated. It's almost impossible to make, if you come at a ninth grade, from ages 14 on, how in the world are you supposed to, okay?
Oh, okay.
I don't know what that is.
One of the things too that would be important to find out as an advocate for these students is how long can they stay in school, and that's usually determined by the state. And I just did something on Saturday with a book study group on how long they can stay in California as to go to school until they can graduate. And sometimes they're asked to really look into adult education, which may or may not have an academic enough program for them to really get a high school, a GED. So you really want to know that, especially for the concerns about how many years beyond the date of entrance they're going to need till they're proficient enough to graduate. And so you can check that out at your state level to see that information, and that's really important to know.
Right.
Okay. I think that's it. I've been looking on here, seeing if we missed anything.
I see one about, is there any data on the number of refugee camps? There's a lot. If anything, if you want to know about refugees, go to the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. I was just on there a couple days ago. I think there's something like, oh God, I'm gonna give the wrong number, like 80 million refugees, but I could be way off on that. But I know it's a huge number. It's more than we've ever had in the world history. And we need to get as many of them as possible some hope for the future. Obviously, what they want is to go back home. So if there's any way that the world can figure out how to get Syria fixed or Somalia fixed so that the families can go back, that's what they would prefer. But when those countries are in such shape that it doesn't look like that's an option, then we need to find ways to help them to find a future that provides some kind of hope for them.
Okay. I think that's it. I'm looking, I don't see anything else that I think we've touched on. Yes, Catholic charities and Jewish vocational services are often very helpful, and they will help. I know that there were refugees that came into the Kansas City area, and Jewish Family Services was very helpful there.
There's
Along
9
with-
organizations nationally that resettle refugees, and you can find out who they are with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So almost every state, I think, has at least one. Some states have 3 or 4.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Kelly.
All right, well,
we
are coming to the end of our time. So
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I can tell that this is a hot topic on everybody's mind. We had close to 1,000 people register for this webinar today. So those of you who are here live are not alone in your concerns with what's going on with our students. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Brenda and Judith for sharing the information. We know it's just the tip of the iceberg. Hopefully you'll consider joining us in the 15-hour pathway of courses. The recording of this session and the slides will be available later this evening, depending on how long it takes for Zoom to process that and get it back to us. I will post those on our website at the link where you registered, which has been in the chat box. If you subscribe to our emails, you will also get the link to the recording and the slides in an email. Sometimes those get trapped in spam filters, so we post it on the website as well, so you can check either place. I'm guessing it's going to be later this evening, and you should probably be in bed by then. But if you're not, it'll be up within an hour or two usually. So thank you again for showing up and being here, and it's great to see all your faces, and I hope we see you again soon. check our webinar page. We have a few more coming up in the next couple weeks, so you can jump in on those as well.
Okay,
Any last words, Brenda, Judith?
nope. Thank
No.
you for
All right.
attending, and we hope we see you in the future courses.
Right.
All
and
right.
have a
Good night,
evening.
everybody.
Good night. Good night.